Okay, so this is part 2 of theories of the new class by Joshua Muravchik. And this first section of part 2 is titled "The Adversary Culture." Schumpeter, Podhoretz, Kirkpatrick, Lipset, Bell. One group of writers has viewed the new class as being merely a numerical expansion of an old social type, the intellectuals. New section, Joseph Schumpeter. The roots of this view are to be found in the writings of Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter's book, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, first published in 1942, was a response to Marx. Schumpeter admired capitalism and feared socialism, yet Schumpeter concluded, regretfully, that Marx was right in the view that capitalism was doomed and would be supplanted by socialism. Where Marx was wrong, in Schumpeter's opinion, was Marx's selection of the class destined to be the agency of this world historic transformation. It was not the proletariat that would overturn capitalism. It was, said Schumpeter, the intellectuals. On the question of whether the intellectuals constitute a class, Schumpeter said simply, quote, "Intellectuals are not a social class in the sense in which peasants or industrial laborers constitute social classes, ... Yet intellectuals develop group attitudes and group interests sufficiently strong to make large numbers of them behave in the way that is usually associated with the concept of social classes," end quote. Schumpeter. Compared to that of today, the intellectual group at the time of Schumpeter's observations was rather small. Schumpeter spoke of the, quote, "vigorous expansion," end quote, of higher education. But in 1940, less than 5% of Americans over the age of 25 had completed college. Today, the proportion is 3 times as large. Thus, Schumpeter did not believe the intellectuals could make a revolution themselves. Rather, quote, "the role of the intellectual group consists primarily in stimulating, energizing, verbalizing, and organizing, bracket, other, larger classes, end bracket, and only secondarily in adding to it," end quote. Schumpeter. Why then regard the intellectuals as the main revolutionary class if their role is only catalytic? Because without the intellectuals, the other classes would not become revolutionary at all. Their revolutionary agitation makes the labor movement, quote, "into something that differs substantially from what it would be without them," end quote. Schumpeter. In this, Schumpeter echoes Lenin, who said in What Is to Be Done, quote, "There could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers. It would have to be brought to them from without, ... The working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness." The theory of socialism, however, grew out of the philosophic, historical, and economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the propertied classes, by intellectuals, end quote. Lenin, What Is to Be Done? In Schumpeter's view, the intellectuals are anything but a new category. Schumpeter saw the sophists of ancient Greece as good examples of the species. What was new about the intellectuals and politically decisive was not the intellectuals' growing numbers, but the new freedom that capitalism gave the intellectuals. For millennia, the intellectuals, by the intellectuals' penchant for criticism, had been held in check by the rulers. Too quick a tongue could be cut out, or its bearer put somewhere where none would be likely to hear it. But capitalism liberated and protected the intellectuals. Schumpeter believed that freedom of speech and freedom of enterprise were closely related. A government that does not allow its citizens to speak as they will is not likely to allow citizens to do business as citizens will, said Schumpeter, and this is understood by the bourgeois class. Hence, quote, "any attack on the intellectuals must run up against the private fortresses of bourgeois business, which, or some of which, will shelter the quarry," end quote. Schumpeter. Even though the bourgeois may abhor the actions of the intellectuals, the bourgeois, quote, "will rally behind the intellectuals because the freedom it disapproves cannot be crushed without crushing the freedom the bourgeois does approve," end quote. Schumpeter. But if this is what liberates the intellectual class to work its subversive ways, it still does not explain what motivates the subversion. To this, Schumpeter offered two answers. First, quote, the intellectual group cannot help nibbling, bracket, at the foundations of capitalist society, end bracket, because the intellectual group lives on criticism, and the intellectual group's whole position depends on criticism that stings, end quote. Schumpeter. In addition, Schumpeter said that the rapid expansion of higher education had left many college-educated people unemployed. Yeah, I had a couple of them earlier. First, the, quote, intellectual group cannot help nibbling at the foundations of capitalist society because it lives on criticism and its whole position depends on criticism that stings, end quote. In addition, Schumpeter said that the rapid expansion of higher education had left many college-educated people unemployed or employed at unsatisfactory jobs, and this created resentment and a group interest of, quote, proletarian hue, end quote, in changing the system. New section, Lionel Trilling. The application of Schumpeter's insights or similar insights to American developments of the 1960s began with Lionel Trilling. Writing in 1965 in the preface to his book, Beyond Culture, Trilling coined the term, quote, adversary culture, end quote. Like Schumpeter, Lionel Trilling coined the term, quote, adversary culture, end quote. Like Schumpeter, Trilling found nothing new in the alienation of the intellectuals. Lionel Trilling said, quote, any historian of the literature of the modern age will take virtually for granted the adversary intention, the actually subversive intention that characterizes modern writing, end quote. Lionel Trilling. However, an important change was making itself felt, quote, the difference can be expressed quite simply in numerical terms, end quote, said Trilling. Quote, there are a great many more people who adopt the adversary program than there formerly were, end quote. Lionel Trilling. This numerical growth justified designating the bearers of the adversary culture a, quote, class. As a result, it has begun to act, quote, like any other class with a degree of power, ... It seeks to aggrandize and perpetuate itself, end quote. Lionel Trilling. New section, Norman Podhoretz. Norman Podhoretz shares the view of Trilling, Norman Podhoretz's former teacher, that the new class is best understood as a modern variant of an old phenomenon, the adversary culture, which Podhoretz traces back at least to the American Civil War. The illusion of novelty was given to the radicalism of the 1960s by the contrast with the staid atmosphere of the 1950s. But in Podhoretz's view, it was the intellectual climate of the 50s that was unusual, while that of the 60s was a return to tradition. Having said this, Norman Podhoretz was willing to grant two noteworthy differences between the adversary culture of the last 20 years and its pre-World War II predecessors. First was a difference of scale. Quote, what had formerly been the attitude of a minuscule group on the margins of American society now began assuming the proportions of a veritable mass movement, end quote. Norman Podhoretz. Second, the recent variant is even more virulent in its antipathy to American society than were its ancestors. Why should the attitude of the intellectuals be so hostile? Why should the intellectuals have grown increasingly hostile to a society in which their prestige and influence is growing markedly? Norman Podhoretz answered by reference to Tocqueville's observation that the revolutionary potential of a class is more likely to be actualized when that class's circumstances are improving than when that class's circumstances are declining. The very rise of the intellectuals had only served to whet their appetites for still more power and prestige. Podhoretz concludes, quote, if in an earlier period bourgeois society was hated because bourgeois society ignored and despised the intellectuals, now bourgeois society was hated because, despite all the concessions bourgeois society had made, bourgeois society still refused to be ruled by the intellectuals, end quote. Norman Podhoretz. New section, Seymour Martin Lipset. I have a piece by Lipset on this channel. It was in the Neither Socialism Nor Capitalism book edited by E. Haberkern and Arthur Lippow. Seymour Martin Lipset. Writing in Commentary, the magazine Norman Podhoretz edits, Seymour Martin Lipset presented an analysis of the radical intellectuals that differs in some interesting ways from that of Podhoretz. Lipset assiduously avoided using the word, quote, class in respect to intellectuals. To Seymour Martin Lipset, the phenomenon of the 1960s was indeed something new, at least for America and the Western countries. Seymour Martin Lipset called it the emergence of a, quote, intelligentsia. Seymour Martin Lipset reminded his readers that the Russian term, quote, intelligentsia, did not signify something only about the occupational or educational status of those to whom the term intelligentsia was applied. The term intelligentsia also had an inherent political connotation. Those so designated were, in Seymour Martin Lipset's words, quote, cosmopolitans, bracket who, and bracket, viewed their own nations as backward and politically reactionary, end quote. Seymour Martin Lipset. The, quote, intelligentsia, end quote, was a phenomenon of pre-communist Russia and Eastern Europe, but, said Seymour Martin Lipset, quote, until recently, the intelligentsia was missing from culturally and economically developed nations, end quote. Seymour Martin Lipset. In contrast to Podhoretz, who emphasized the continuity of 1960s radicalism with an intellectual tradition at least a century old, Seymour Martin Lipset emphasized that, quote, opinion polls up to the 1950s suggested that the large majority of the well-educated and of college students were Republicans, end quote. Seymour Martin Lipset. Seymour Martin Lipset refrained in Seymour Martin Lipset's essay in Commentary from offering a confident explanation of why this new phenomenon had occurred. Seymour Martin Lipset said that, quote, the new intelligentsia is an outgrowth of conditions in post-industrial society which made a mass phenomenon of the educated classes, end quote. Seymour Martin Lipset. But the irony of this observation is that this observation perceives in the most recent developments of the most advanced societies a phenomenon it defines as characteristic of backward societies. Why should the arrival of, quote, post-industrial, end quote, society in the United States give birth to a formation heretofore associated with pre-industrial Tsarist Russia? New section, Jean J. Kirkpatrick. Like Norman Podhoretz, Jean Kirkpatrick believes that, quote, the anti-establishment politics of the 1960s, end quote, reflects the spread of, quote, avant-garde culture, through rising college enrollments, the electronic media, and mass circulation magazines, end quote. Jean Kirkpatrick. Kirkpatrick emphasizes more than other writers that, quote, the new class can be recognized not by the new class's socioeconomic characteristics, but by the new class's relation to culture, end quote. Jean Kirkpatrick. Jean Kirkpatrick is aware that the idea of a, quote, class, not based on socioeconomic characteristics, is an unconventional one. Yet, Jean Kirkpatrick avoids entering a discussion of what constitutes a, quote, class. The point seems to be that the anti-establishment movements of the 60s can be understood as the activities of a group of people bearing a certain standing in our culture, and the question of whether or not this group deserves to be called a, quote, class is of secondary concern. What is the special role of these people? These people are the, quote, wordsmiths or, quote, symbol specialists, end quote. Jean Kirkpatrick. Their rise accompanies the rise of modernity. In traditional society, social arrangements were accepted as given. Things were as things must be. The breakdown of traditional forms and traditional forms' replacement by modern forms created a need for justification. Now it could be seen that things need not be as things were. In that circumstance, quote, moralists and wordsmiths become indispensable to rulers who need continuous legitimation of their power, end quote. Jean Kirkpatrick. Yet the idea that the symbol specialists have been raised up by rulers to perform a function of legitimation, that this accounts for their rise, bumps up against much empirical experience. The symbol specialist plays such an accommodating role, neither in the United States nor in the West, and in the communist world only in a very limited sense. It, of course, is true that in communist countries, all means of communication are compelled to contribute to the legitimation of the existing order, but the evidence does not suggest that this is a role the intellectuals are content to play. On the contrary, there is evidence of reluctance and discontent, evidence that the symbol specialists play the role of legitimation only under the watchful prodding of the violence specialists. It is not intellectuals who rule communist societies. The symbol specialists who help to make communist revolutions generally give way after the revolution to men with more mundane specialties, as Trotsky did to Stalin, Djilas did to Tito, and even in some sense Mao did to Zhou and Liu and Teng. Perhaps the symbol specialists play a legitimating role in parts of the Third World, but this is far from obvious, and indeed the reason that the, quote, new class attracted attention in the first place was its inclination to attack, not uphold, the legitimacy of rulers. Jean Kirkpatrick herself points this out, and Jean Kirkpatrick offers an explanation for it more satisfying than Schumpeter's meager explanation that the intellectual class lives by criticism. Jean Kirkpatrick hypothesizes that, quote, the most important source of the adversary culture is the intellectual's habit of measuring institutions and practices against abstract standards. Reality is invariably found unsatisfactory, end quote. Jean Kirkpatrick. An important implication of this is that the intellectuals needn't be on the left. Jean Kirkpatrick says that, quote, members of the new class do not necessarily share the same political views and values. The members of the new class may be found across our multidimensional political spectrum, end quote. Jean Kirkpatrick. But a second implication would be that, whether left or right, the tendency of the intellectuals would be antagonistic to the status quo. Yet Kirkpatrick takes note, as does Podhoretz, of the recent emergence of neoconservatism, a movement of which they are both important members. Kirkpatrick observes that intellectuals may embrace the, quote, mission of, quote, defending, the dominant political culture, end quote, as well as of attacking it. From the theories that treat the new class as an expansion of the adversary culture arise two especially interesting questions. Why are the intellectuals arrayed in hostility to their society? Must intellectuals remain so? Schumpeter, Podhoretz, and Kirkpatrick offer three different answers to the first question. Schumpeter says that the intellectual's currency is criticism, and that they cannot help but criticize the social system in which they live. Kirkpatrick says that the rationalist attitude leads the intellectuals to compare the way things are against the way things might be, and to find the former wanting. Podhoretz says that the intellectuals once resented society for having so little use for the intellectuals. But now that the intellectual situation is improved dramatically, the intellectuals are intoxicated by the taste of power, and the intellectuals attack society in order to conquer society. Curiously, of these three explanations of the hostility of the intellectuals, Schumpeter's is the least well elaborated, the least convincing, for surely it is correct to say that the activity of intellectuals is, quote, criticism. This is true not in the narrow sense of, quote, criticism, which means fault-finding, but in the broader sense of the word, which denotes analyzing and evaluating, as in literary criticism. While it is clear that intellectuals must analyze and evaluate society, it is not clear that they must find fault with it. What is curious is that, of the three, Schumpeter is the only one who seems to believe that the adversarial role is inevitable, who does not raise the possibility of the intellectuals playing a different role. By contrast, Kirkpatrick and Podhoretz, though each has an explanation more elaborate than Schumpeter's of why the intellectuals behave as the intellectuals do, both admit the possibility that intellectuals can, and that some, in fact, do, behave differently. New section, the public sector expanders. Kristall, Phillips, Glaser, Wildavsky. Among the writers who are politically unfriendly to the new class are several who agree with Harrington in his later views that the new radicalism does signify the emergence of a new class, and that the new class is motivated by its own concrete self-interest. Like Harrington, these writers believe that the new class has an interest in expanding the public sector and in promoting social, quote, planning by government, but whereas Harrington treats these things as desiderata, these writers view the expansion of government with alarm. While Harrington has said that he hopes the new class will go from planning for others to planning for itself and others, these critics of the new class have said that the new class plans for itself in the guise of planning for others. They charge that the politics of the new class are built around promoting public programs that are presented as benefiting the poor or the workers, or the, quote, public interest, but that in the end redound primarily to the benefit of the new class. New section, Irving Kristol. One such view of the new class is that expressed by Irving Kristol, who feels that what motivates the new class is the quest for power. The new class's members, quote, are persuaded that they can do a better job of running our society and feel entitled to have the opportunity, end quote. Irving Kristol. Kristol does not accuse the new class of seeking material gain. The new class does not expand the public sector in order to live off the benefits. Rather, the new class seeks to expand the public sector because that has the effect of moving more and more of society's decisions out of the marketplace and into the meeting halls. The new class, more articulate than the new class is wealthy, is better able to dominate the meeting halls than the marketplace. Quote, and so, says Kristol, the new class tries, quote, to supersede economics by politics, an activity in which it is most competent, end quote. Irving Kristol. The ultimate cause of this drive for power by the new class is a, quote, religious vacuum, end quote. Irving Kristol. The problem is that bourgeois society is so vulgarly democratic, so mundane, so unheroic, so boring, it fails to answer spiritual needs. The new class, free to a great extent from concern with material needs, wants to rule because the new class believes that the new class can provide greater spiritual satisfaction, a better, quote, quality of life, end quote. The rise of the radical new class is thus, in Kristol's view, attributable at root to the, quote, death of God, end quote. Irving Kristol. New section, Kevin Phillips. In Kevin Phillips' book, Mediocrity, like media-ocracy, or media, like instead of like, yeah, mediocracy. Kevin Phillips describes the rise of a new class comprising, quote, the people who shape and market ideas and information, end quote. Kevin Phillips. Inspired by Daniel Bell's idea of, quote, post-industrial society. Kevin Phillips' analysis focuses on the rapidly expanding, quote, knowledge sector of the economy, end quote, which now, in Phillips' estimate, accounts for approximately 40% of national income. Phillips concedes that the new class does not include all who work in the knowledge sector. Rather, this sector is riven into two groups. One, quote, essentially engaged in social and human resources endeavors, academicians, urban planners, journalists, social welfare experts, end quote. And another, quote, whose expertise is spent in the direction of military and aerospace research, product marketing, and industrial technology, end quote. Kevin Phillips. It is the first of these that makes up Kevin Phillips' new class, the mediocrity. The politics of this new class are shaped in part by liberal ideology. The mediocrity has inherited the tradition of the intelligentsia, but the more powerful determination of new class politics is down-to-earth self-interest. The new class is a, quote, vested interest in, quote, social engineering, end quote, because social engineering employs the new class. The new class does the research. The new class writes the studies. The new class formulates and administers the resulting programs. Phillips says, quote, as the knowledge sector expansion and social concern of the 60s caught on, there was an ever-increasing array of bureaucrats, foundations, planning groups, and business concerns that developed a major economic stake in and lobbied for the services/indirect subsidies approach to combating poverty, end quote. Kevin Phillips. The result has been the creation of a, quote, new multi-billion-dollar social engineering industry, end quote. Kevin Phillips. The self-interest of the new class impels the new class to champion social engineering, yet the new class's interests are larger. Not only social engineering, but change itself serves the new class. Kevin Phillips says that, quote, change is as essential to the knowledge sector as inventory turnover is to a merchant or manufacturer. Change keeps up demand for the product, research, news, theory, and technology, end quote. Kevin Phillips. The emerging politics of the future will be characterized by a conflict that arrays the new class with the new class's program of ceaseless change in social engineering financed by an expanding public sector against the classes of producers, bourgeois and proletarian, who favor lower taxes and traditional values. It is not certain which side will win. New section, Nathan Glazer. In an essay titled Lawyers in the New Class, Nathan Glazer carries Kevin Phillips' line of analysis a step further. While Kevin Phillips defines the new class in terms of the relations to the, quote, knowledge sector of the economy and argues that the new class is an interest in the expansion of the public sector, Glazer seems to say that dedication to expansion of the public sector is itself the definition of the membership in the new class. In considering whether lawyers should be counted as members of the new class, Nathan Glazer reports that the members of this profession, are, quote, largely self-employed, and overwhelmingly engaged in working for businessmen and the wealthy, end quote. Nathan Glazer. Only a minuscule number are engaged in, quote, public interest, end quote, law. Nonetheless, Nathan Glazer concludes that, quote, lawyers are indeed important members of the, quote, new class if we consider that the new class's essential character is to call for, to defend, and to benefit from the expansion of government, end quote. Nathan Glazer. Nathan Glazer wrestles with the paradox that many of the causes pursued by those engaged in liberal crusading legal work are aimed at restricting rather than expanding the activities of government. For example, in the field of civil liberties, Nathan Glazer concludes that even where such legal work has the goal of restricting the executive agencies of government, it still has the effect of augmenting the jurisdiction of the courts and the complexity of the law. Thereby it serves to make more work for lawyers and conforms to the hypothesis that the characteristic activity of the new class is to expand the government for the government's own. It serves to make more work for lawyers and conforms to the hypothesis that the characteristic activity of the new class is to expand the government for the new class's own benefit. New section, Aaron Wildavsky. In Aaron Wildavsky's opinion, the self-interest that the new class is pursuing can be described as, quote, social distance, end quote. The privileges that once came with the income and status of the finer professions have been eviscerated by the workings of democracy and affluence. Plumbers and auto workers are now members of the middle class, and the distance between the lower middle class and the upper middle class is not enough to make the upper middle class comfortable. There are a few things that the professor can do or buy, or places that he can go that the riveter cannot, perhaps with a bit more sacrifice, with a bit more sacrifice, buy or do or visit as well. It is this loss of privilege on the part of the upper middle class that underlies the rebellion of the new class, and the political program of that class is to use public policy to construct privileges for itself that it can't acquire at the marketplace. Thus, for example, one of the fruits of environmentalism, a cause cherished by the new class, has been the preservation of wilderness areas that serve as playlands for members of the new class more than for others. The advocacy of subsidized mass transit results in systems that carry new class members to their offices downtown, but rarely stop at factories or construction sites. In sum, says Wildavsky, quote, the politics of the new class is similar to the Marxist interpretation of the politics of the old classes, getting others to pay for your privileges. End quote. Aaron Wildavsky. All four writers who see the new class as dedicated to expansion of the public sector agree that the motor of new class politics is self-interest, notwithstanding whatever claims it may make to speak for high principle. The, quote, public interest, or the well-being of variously socially disadvantaged groups. What distinguishes these writers from each other is these writers' diverse interpretations of what constitutes the self-interest that the new class pursues. Phillips and Glaser portray the new class pursuing material self-interest, jobs and grants. Irving Kristol portrays it as seeking power. Wildavsky believes that it is after, quote, position and privilege, end quote. Aaron Wildavsky. New section. Skeptics. Hacker, Bruce Briggs, Bell. While Harrington and Bazelon hail the new class, and Kristol and Phillips deplore the new class, some other writers doubt that the new class exists at all. These are the skeptics. None of these skeptics fails to see the phenomena that inspire affection in Bazelon and animus in Kristol. On the contrary, all the skeptics have elsewhere commented on the political activities of the new left or the new politics, but all of them have doubts, perhaps no stronger than agnosticism, that these political movements constitute or reflect a new class. New section. Andrew Hacker. In his essay titled Two, quote, New Classes, or None, Andrew Hacker notes that, quote, there are two contenders for the title, end quote, parenthesis, i.e. of new class, end parenthesis, and that there is, quote, almost no overlap in membership, end quote, between these. Andrew Hacker refers to American society, explicitly excluding from his discussion the new class that Shactman and Djilas say rules communist societies. The two new classes in America are Burnham's managerial class and the liberal, affluent, educated professionals discussed by Harrington, Phillips, Kristol, and others. Andrew Hacker doubts that either of these groups deserves to be called a class. The managers are, quote, simply highly placed employees, and there are hardly enough of them to make a class, end quote. Andrew Hacker. The educated professionals, says Andrew Hacker, belong to a very old class. Quote, belong to a very old class. The educated professionals work for a living just as most people always have. The color of the educated professionals' collars may have changed. The educated professionals have larger vocabularies. The educated professionals receive comparatively generous salaries, ... Many may be upper-level employees, but educated professionals are still at the upper level of our proletariat and do not constitute a special class by themselves, end quote. Andrew Hacker. Andrew Hacker suggests that membership in a class does not consist only in occupying a particular role. Class membership also somehow inheres in the person. It is internalized and transcends socioeconomic role. In the case both of the managers and of the educated professionals, Andrew Hacker says that the individuals have no distinct class identity in their personages. They are merely filling roles. Such anonymous role fillers cannot, by Andrew Hacker's standard, constitute a class. New section. Barry Bruce Briggs. Barry Bruce Briggs has produced a book about the idea of the new class. The book consists of a collection of essays solicited and edited by Barry Bruce Briggs, many of which are discussed in this paper. In an essay written as a conclusion to the book, Barry Bruce Briggs evaluates the theories of the new class and comes away agnostic. There is, Barry Bruce Briggs says, a group, quote, of well-paid, parenthesis, but more likely from tax than market sources, end parenthesis, and well-educated, parenthesis, but more likely literate than numerate, end parenthesis, folk who are secular, hardly averse to achieving their goals through government, and fiercely defensive of the autonomy of their personal behavior and economic institutions. Is someone to call them a new class? Why not? End quote. Barry Bruce Briggs. Barry Bruce Briggs expresses skepticism toward many of the ideas associated with the new class theories. Barry Bruce Briggs argues that despite the structural changes in the economy on which so much theorizing about the new class rests, the scientist is the only new occupational type who figures in discussions of the new class. Quote, every other type appears full-blown at least as early as the High Middle Ages, end quote. Barry Bruce Briggs. Yet scientists exhibit the attitudes that are associated with the new class much less frequently than do many older occupational groups. Professors in the natural science, for example, are markedly more conservative than are those in the humanities and social sciences. Barry Bruce Briggs criticizes some of the, quote, adversary culture and, quote, theories of the new class. Barry Bruce Briggs dismisses Schumpeter's view, and by implication, Jean Kirkpatrick's similar view, that the, quote, rationalist attitude, end quote, propagated by capitalism, parenthesis, Schumpeter, end parenthesis, and personified by the intellectuals, parenthesis, Jean Kirkpatrick, end parenthesis, leads to the anti-establishmentarian stance of the new class. No group more thoroughly partakes of the rationalist attitude, says Bruce Briggs, than scientists, yet they, as already noted, exhibit fewer typical class views than do other intellectuals. Barry Bruce Briggs argues that the shift of the intellectual current from rightward to leftward may be accounted for by a, quote, change in market, end quote. Barry Bruce Briggs explains that intellectuals have never been able to support themselves financially. Years ago, the intellectuals were subsidized by private wealth, today by public funds. Correspondingly, the intellectuals have gone from a right-wing, i.e. pro-private enterprise stance, to a left-wing, pro-public sector position. This carries Barry Bruce Briggs very close to Kevin Phillips' idea that the new class serves the new class's own material interests by expanding the public sector. Yet later in Barry Bruce Briggs' essay, Barry Bruce Briggs backs away from this position. Barry Bruce Briggs acknowledges that, quote, a glaring weakness in trying to make an economic link to the appearance of new class attitudes is the apparent conflict between neo-isolationism and the wonderful opportunities offered by the foreign policy intelligence defense business, end quote. Barry Bruce Briggs. Daniel Bell. Much of the theorizing about the new class has been inspired or encouraged by the writings of Daniel Bell, especially Daniel Bell's widely discussed book, The Coming of Post-Industrial Society. In The Coming of Post-Industrial Society, Daniel Bell described an epochal social transformation already begun in which the production and distribution of knowledge replaces the production and distribution of goods as the principal activity around which society is organized. Businessmen will be replaced as society's dominant figures by, quote, new men, scientists, mathematicians, economists, and, quote, the engineers of the new intellectual technology, end quote. In Bell's vision, education will become the, quote, mode of access to power, end quote, Daniel Bell. And the university, quote, will become the central institution of the next 100 years, end quote, Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell failed to convey a clear picture of the class structure of post-industrial society. Daniel Bell most often used the term, quote, stratum, or, quote, constituency, when talking of Daniel Bell's, quote, new men. Yet in places, Daniel Bell spoke of, quote, the class of knowledge workers, end quote. In another place, Daniel Bell observed that technologists are not now, quote, bound by a sufficient common interest to make them a political class, end quote. Daniel Bell. But the technologist might become a political class in the future. Daniel Bell did not say whether there is a difference between a, quote, political class and a, quote, class. Still elsewhere, Daniel Bell suggested that in mature form, post-industrial society will spawn not one, but three new classes: an upper class of scientists, a middle class of professors, and a proletariat made up of teaching assistants. This carelessness now haunts Bell. While Bell's work has contributed so much to the rise of theories of the new class, Bell has become the most trenchant critic of those theories. Much of the new class theorizing, such as that of Michael Harrington or Kevin Phillips, takes the new left, new politics, counterculture phenomena of the 60s as evidence of the existence of a new class, and takes Bell's analysis of the changing economy as proof that the social structure must indeed be creating a new class. But Bell's, quote, new men and the participants in the various anti-establishment manifestations of the 60s are not the same people. Thus, Daniel Bell argues, quote, the term, the idea, quote, the new class, end quote, is a linguistic and sociological muddle. The term new class mixes together two concepts, the emergence of a new social stratum, and the stridency of a new cultural attitude, end quote. Daniel Bell. Even in the coming of post-industrial society, Daniel Bell observed the distinction between what he saw as the important stratum of the future and the counterculturists of today. Daniel Bell wrote of, quote, a deep and growing split between the technical intelligentsia, who are committed to functional rationality and technocratic modes of operation, and the literary intellectuals, who have become increasingly apocalyptic, hedonistic, and nihilistic, end quote. Daniel Bell. In his recent essay, Daniel Bell objects to lumping these groups into one new class. Daniel Bell says that, quote, it is questionable whether the amorphous block designated as the, quote, knowledge stratum, end quote, has sufficient community of interest to form a class, end quote. Daniel Bell. Daniel Bell argues that, quote, there are few institutional arrangements that bring these groups together, end quote. Daniel Bell. What then, Daniel Bell asks, would be the ideology of a new class comprising all these elements? It can only be meritocracy. For merit, intellectual skill, is all that they have in common, but far from espousing meritocracy, the political program of this group, says Daniel Bell, tends towards radical egalitarianism. Quote, the, quote, theoreticians of the new equality are largely intellectuals from the meritocratic class, end quote. Daniel Bell notes. Daniel Bell continues to believe that a new social system is emerging. To Bell, the cultural convulsions of the last decades have been a manifestation of the death throes of the old society, not of the birth pangs of the new society. All the skeptics of the existence of a new class join in pointing out that the term new class has been loosely used to describe more than one different strata. Hacker, I think that was Andrew Hacker, emphasizes the contrast between the new class of managers identified by James Burnham and the new class of intellectuals described by most of the other theorists. Andrew Hacker's distinction parallels, John Kenneth Galbraith? I think that's what Galbraith's first name is, right? Breakdown of his new class into the two classes, the technostructure and the educational and scientific estate. Barry Bruce Briggs and Daniel Bell, on the other hand, refer hardly at all to the managers. Barry Bruce Briggs and Daniel Bell are at pains to point out that there are two disparate strata within the second of Andrew Hacker's new classes, the literati and the technologists. In Barry Bruce Briggs and Daniel Bell's view, quote, the educational and scientific estate, end quote, is a composite of contradictions. New section, summary and conclusion. Those who have written about the appearance of a new class may be grouped in 5 categories. One category, Djilas et al., addresses primarily communist societies and describes the rulers of these as constituting a new class. This group of theories is unexceptionable up to a point. First, set aside the problem of defining classes and make it axiomatic that societies are ruled by classes. Then, if it is observed that A, communist societies are ruled, and B, the communist societies are ruled neither by capitalists, nor by nobles, nor by any other previously seen class, then, ipso facto, there is a new class ruling communist societies. The other 4 categories of new class theories all address the United States or Western society, although some describe phenomena taken to exist worldwide. Of these 4 categories, 1, Bell et al., denies or doubts that a new class exists. The other 3 affirm that a new class exists. These 3, that affirm that a new class exists see the new class as a revolutionary force or a class inclined toward radicalism, serving as a surrogate for or a supplement to the proletariat in the Marxian scheme of socialist revolution. One of these groups, Bazelon et al., welcomes such a force. The other two abhor it. Of these two, one, Phillips et al., sees the new class as working to expand the public sector to serve its own concrete interests. The other, Schumpeter, what the hell is Trilling's name? I can't remember. Joseph Schumpeter Trilling, was it Robert? I can't remember. Trilling et al. Sees it as a growth of the, quote, adversary culture, end quote. All of the theories that describe a new class in Western societies, whether they welcome it or abhor it, are unsatisfying. None of these theories begins with a definition of class. If Marx did not leave an adequate definition, Marx did leave a clear explanation of the significance of class. In the essay, Alienation and Social Classes, Marx said, quote, "Is not a matter of what this or that proletarian, or even the proletariat as a whole, pictures at present as the proletariat's goal. It is a matter of what the proletariat is in actuality. What the proletariat is in actuality, and what in accordance with this being, the proletariat will historically be compelled to do." End quote. Marx. This is what makes class important. Political behavior cannot be explained in terms of the private ideational activity of individuals, but only by discovering the concrete interests of the groups of which they are part. The idea of socialism thus corresponding to the interests of the class of proletarians. That is why to understand politics it is necessary to analyze classes as opposed to the much simpler task of analyzing ideas. It is the vital connection between interest and ideas that makes class an indispensable framework for analysis. It is here that the various theories of the new class fail. The various theories of the new class do not establish a clear, compelling connection between the ideas of the new class and the new class's, quote, class interests. The theories that begin by examining the ideas of the new class, quote, the adversary culture, end quote, fail to demonstrate that a material interest underlies those ideas. The theories that begin by identifying the material interest of the new class in the expansion of the public sector fail to show how the ideas of the new class relate to that interest, or succeed in showing such a relationship only by misrepresenting those ideas. Whether they have the rise of a, quote, conscience constituency, or fear the destructiveness of a, quote, adversary culture, end quote, none of the theories that approach the problem of the new class in terms of the new class's ideas is very persuasive in connecting those ideas to a specific class interest. Harrington and Trilling don't even try. All of these theories tend to identify the new class by the new class's ideas. If you are an adherent of the new left or new liberalism, then you are perforce a member of the new class. But if we define this new liberalism, then you are perforce a member of the new class. But if we define this new class by its ideas, then what makes it a class? Would it make sense as well to speak of liberals as a class, or conservatives, moderates, Democrats, Republicans, free traders, anti-abortionists? If we speak of the new left or the new politics as political movements embodying certain ideas, what is added by describing these as the movements of a class? The problems deepen. Even those who define the new class by the new class's ideas acknowledge that it has no fixed ideology. It is pointed out that the adversary culture of an earlier period had a strong right-wing contingent. It is agreed that intellectuals could embrace conservative or neoconservative ideas in the future, that even now the intellectuals are more divided among themselves than they were a decade ago. But if we know the new class by its ideas, and its ideas are subject to change, then how do we know it at all? And if we acknowledge that the intellectuals can be divided among themselves, then what basis is there for considering them a class at all? One could build an answer to some of these questions on a point made by Jean Kirkpatrick. Intellectuals, Jean Kirkpatrick says, compare today's reality with abstract ideals and inevitably find today's reality wanting. From this one might infer the theorem that the intellectuals can be left or right, but not center. The one thing they cannot abide is the status quo. This might explain why the intellectuals could move from right to left and still embody distinctive class attitudes. But such an explanation runs afoul of recent experience. The fact is that Kirkpatrick and Podhoretz are two prime examples of a new current within the intellectual community that is neither left nor right. Neoconservatism, as this current is called, has as its central idea defense of the value of American institutions. And what is so strange about this? If the, quote, rationalist attitude, end quote, enables intellectuals to imagine better alternatives to the status quo, doesn't it also enable them to imagine worse ones? The writers who begin by examining the interests of the new class are on much stronger theoretical ground. Phillips, Kristall, Wildavsky each builds a theory that has internal logic and that explains the behavior of the new class in terms consistent with the customary ways in which classes behave. The only problem with these theories is that the behavior described bears very little resemblance to the behavior of the groups they are discussing. No one familiar with the history of the new left and new politics should feel comfortable saying that these movements have been mainly motivated by a drive to expand the public sector. The very term, quote, new, adopted by these movements in their names was meant to signal a rejection of the policies of traditional liberalism and traditional socialism. What exactly was being rejected? Nothing else but the, quote, stale policies of public sector expansion. These new movements relentlessly attacked the federal government, the welfare state, the traditional democratic politicians, organized labor, all the forces and policies of public sector expansion. What have been the issues of the new class has made its own? Opposition to the war in Vietnam, to, quote, militarism, to defense spending, to containment, to the CIA, etc., support of civil rights, quotas, quote, black power, community control, quote, the voucher system, and other alternatives to the public school system, advocacy of liberalized laws governing abortion, drugs, homosexuality, etc., fervent embrace of environmentalism. It takes a purposive reading indeed to see in these programs a consistent goal of expanding the public sector. Environmentalism might have that effect, but most of the other issues have the opposite. In her study of presidential elites, Jean Kirkpatrick found that one thing which distinguished McGovern delegates from all other delegates of the 1972 nominating convention was that the McGovern delegates were far more concerned with issues of foreign policy and lifestyle. Indeed, it might be fair to say that what distinguishes the new liberalism of the new class from the old liberalism of the working class is precisely that the new liberalism of the new class has rejected the single-minded commitment to the public sector that since the New Deal has been the touchstone of the old liberalism of the working class. The old liberalism of the working class. It should be added that the defenders of the new class who define it in terms of interest do not do any better than the critics. Harrington's 1979 formulation says that the interest of the new class lies in planning. Harrington also says that modern society is ineluctably based on planning. In that case, all should be well, but not quite. There are two kinds of planning, public and private. Public is good, private is bad, but private planning itself is an illusion. The real choice is between good public planning and bad public planning. The new class already engages in planning. The question is, will the new class plan only for others or for itself as well? Planning for itself and others combined is good. Planning only for others is bad. If the new class plans only for others, the new class will bring about the victory of private planning, which will bring about the victory of bad public planning. If the new class plans only for others, the new class will bring about the victory of private planning, which will bring about the victory of bad public planning, which will bring about the dictatorship of the new class. This is not in the interest of the new class. What is in the interest is to plan for others and itself together, which will bring about the victory of public planning, which will assure the good kind of public planning, which will bring socialism and democracy. The only question is whether Harrington actually had anything at all in mind when Harrington wrote this, or whether Harrington composed it by throwing words on paper in the manner that certain avant-garde artists created works by throwing paint on canvas. In sum, the theories that define the new class in terms of interest hold up even less well than those that define it in terms of ideas. The problems are fundamental. At the heart of the idea of class is the connection between interest and ideas. Otherwise, why speak of class at all? None of the theories of the new class has effectively made that connection. Not one has shown that the political phenomena that were taken as reflecting the views of the new class bear any consistent relationship to any concrete interests of the people who are identified as composing that class. Some have effectively described the ideas of the new class without showing what interest compels the new class to adopt them. Others have identified clear interests that, however, give rise logically to ideas the new class doesn't hold. None has yet given evidence that justifies the term, quote, new class. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening.